So onward with creating content again. So from the previous video, before I kind of had my meltdown and reassessing life again, um, I had suggested using travel and tourism as a way to kind of mine yourself for your creative potential. And the suggestion around creativity was discussed with allowing ourselves the luxury of thinking about life in antiquity in particular. So, how would we want to think about the ancient ruins and how society evolved out of them? So, with or without scripture or literature is almost like, I mean, how would I even do that? Because what do I have to understand about anything? So you can take that approach. You can say, I don't want to read about the Colosseum, for example. I'm just going to go to Europe and I'm going to backpack. And then if I come across this ancient ruin, then hooray, I'm going to try to understand what it is. And I might find these plaques that are set up that maybe give a little bit of the history. That's an approach. And why not? Like, it's almost like that blank slate approach. Um, Another option is to assume kind of like a stance of I already have an idea of what I like doing, like I have an affinity for. And so I'm going to study this group of people, for example, and I want to go and understand the culture that they had. And maybe because from that culture, there was a scripture that evolved, or there's literature that evolved. And from there, I want to sort of try and understand how to compare that with the postmodern world and then bring that home again and then decide how I want to think about the way I want to move forward with my own personal life. So the reason I'm almost suggesting that these are two options is because sometimes people factor in dreams as a way of kind of mining for their creative potential. And this is okay, but just the cautionary idea about dreams is that how you interpret them is very, very tricky. And sometimes it could, if you understand it from a metaphorical perspective, I think it would be okay. So if you see somebody, for example, who you know, not personally, but just like as a persona in the world, sometimes it's good to not think of them as an actual individual, but what they represent abstractly. So if they're a person who travels a lot and so they already have a lot of different understandings about cultures, that might be someone that you can just reach out to and just say, you know what, I'm deciding to take a year off, for example, and study because I have a gap year between high school and maybe post-secondary education. What are your thoughts on studying abroad, for example, right? So then you already have an into something that is contemporary, someone who's, this is basically their work, and then how applicable it is to somebody who, and then you can kind of give your background and say, maybe these are some of the obstacles I foresee and such. So thinking about your your subconscious and your self and your kind of personalized life is really the best way to be creative. So if you have already your creative potential and then you have a blank slate, but it's not necessarily a blank slate because you think all the way back to the beginning of time, our consciousness is basically repeating itself forward. So at one point it might have been a blank slate, but it's not necessarily right now. Um, it's a blank slate relative to what we can know about the world, but our consciousness is still rife with a lot of ideas. And then you have the internet, or you have resources in the world that, like people that are alive right now, or archives that are available for you to kind of read about. So these three almost pathways that are ahead of you are basically a way for people, especially coming out of school or who maybe in midlife and they're not happy with their career or where their life is, and they almost need something to kind of help them break out of that, so that they're not falling into depression or despair, and they just can't find a way out, and there's maybe no supports for them in the world. So because we are in a time in history where there is rapid change, there is a great way for us to do this together without necessarily having to have like a cohort. So if you join groups on Facebook, for example, about travel and tourism, it's something that if you do travel, you can kind of check in with people and it doesn't make you feel like you're kind of alienated yourself because you're on your own. And in doing so, you don't feel like that homesickness that can kind of depress people and make them feel like they're just disjointed about the reality. So there's a lot to think about in doing all this. It's kind of like reading about blogs, for example, about people who do travel and people who may have lost family and dealing with isolation in the world, it has a really, really large impact on a person and their mental health. And so understanding all these things and almost thinking of them as precautions before jumping into something like wholeheartedly and then be kind of disillusioned and wondering about, this isn't at all what I anticipated it would be. And I don't really know what to do. So Eat, Pray, Love is a really good example of how change can really help break someone out of a rut. And I love how the author talks about how her first novel was such a big hit, and then after that she allowed herself that lull where maybe the second publication of her work wasn't as well received, but that she went with it. Like it was just like that effortless kind of whatever life throws at me, I'm not going to fight it or assume that I have to maintain that high, and then be disappointed if I don't get that reception in the world. So another way of appreciating meaning making and how the world evolves and how to come back from something that uh, may be an unfortunate circumstance is to read poetry. Sometimes literature is difficult to get into, if it's scripture or if it's from like a period of time where it's Old English. But if you read something contemporary, it kind of segues or kind of is a gateway into understanding how to build meaning from something that's really succinct and that has potential for so much meaning. Like you can just read it over and over again, and each time you read it, you'll grasp something different. And I think this is something we don't really appreciate, is that we do need to allow ourselves time to read something, take something away from it, and then leave it for a little bit and just let our mind kind of think about it for a little bit and then come back to it and then revisit it over and over and over again. Because the more you do that, the more you understand and appreciate the value of metaphors and meaning, and how people become this sort of this person who understands nuance, and you kind of want to engage in conversation, and then it just becomes who you are then, because then you're just like, I can't get enough of the world, and meaning it just becomes something that you kind of live for. So because our mind does get restless and bored if it's not in something that captures its interest, allow yourself, if you were somebody who was constantly on the go and maybe had a really, really busy schedule, to let your mind slow down and take its time slowing down. Because getting into reading and books, it almost will bore your mind, because it'll be like, it's not fast enough, I need more, and it'll get distracted and it'll want to almost quit on you. So to almost set yourself up for that, so almost say, I'm just going to spend 5 minutes. I'm just going to read this and I'm going to put it down, and then I'm going to reward myself by maybe watching a movie or going for a run or doing something else. And then gradually your ability to focus on something will grow, and then your mind will slow down. So even trying yoga or listening to relaxing music will help your mind sort of relax into a new way of understanding how to interact with it, I guess, as it were. And knowing that you can do this almost opens up an approach to understanding your learning style. So knowing what your temperament is, there's the choleric, there's melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. Um, it'd be really good to read about them. Sometimes you'll find that you're dominant in one, and then there's other ones that sort of overlap a little bit. So there's tends to be about two of them that kind of are dominant for you. I'm melancholic and phlegmatic, which means I'm really slow to absorb information. But the more I absorb it, the better I am at understanding it. And because I'm melancholic, I tend to like to do things alone. So you can imagine I'm a person who's very isolated in the world in a way, and I don't necessarily mind it. Like I almost appreciate that I have that luxury. So understanding your temperament, that kind of goes along with your learning style, and then the time of day that you're able to focus. So for me in the morning, usually my brain is kind of foggy still. I don't actually start to wake up until closer to the end of the day and then through the night. So like I'm a really big night owl. So that's just a great way to set yourself up for success. If you already know um, that you can learn about this for yourself and then go into the world knowing this, you're already ahead of any kind of failure that will almost make you give up before you can really give yourself a fair chance. So something for the school board, I know because I used to work there, and it was an enlightening experience as much as it was kind of difficult to continue to work in, because children by their nature love going to school, and their curiosity about learning, it starts to diminish as they grow, and we're not really sure why, other than that it, learning becomes kind of a chore, right? And we still feel that like as adults, right? Sometimes you look at like a lot of text and it's like, no, there's no way, and you walk away, right? So if we can from a younger age almost allow ourselves, if we're parents or as teachers, to kind of observe how children's learning styles look and kind of build children up for success from that way, I think it'll be easier for families to be able to build bridges with each other through generational gaps. So sometimes fighting the zeitgeist or coming out of a tradition into the postmodern world, we assume that what works for us as kids is going to work for our kids and then our grandkids, without assuming that, you know, the world's changing, the way people learn are changing, never mind what the content is and what the lifestyle is, right? So all these things factor in, and then it's almost like kids want to rebel and they don't want to listen, and they don't have the time to, and if they do, they just feel like depressed about it, like, I'm doing this, but I mean, am I living life fully? And from there, relationships can falter, like they can have difficulties in relationships later on in life and in marriage and with your children. So breaking that kind of generational trauma of what we used to expect of ourselves and what we're learning with technology and science now is almost like, why don't we try to allow ourselves the recognition of, yeah, we are still entrenched in a lot of traditional ways, and we just don't know how to step forward into what the current research is telling us about ourselves and human development, and then allow ourselves to maybe step into that area of gray where, are we allowed to do this? Like, especially if it's something that's religion based. So it's like, is it permissible? Is it not permissible? To what degree are we allowed to before we feel like we've kind of sinned in a way? So again, I spoke previously about how trying substances at 38 was something I was happy to do, just to kind of test this kind of limit. Doing it at a later age was essential for me because it helped me realize the importance of having clarity of mind and how that helps me focus. And then like alcohol and cannabis now are just something that's kind of like a social thing, just to kind of help relax people into environments, especially if they are introverts. So I think that's basically the best way to kind of evolve into post-modernity, and especially if you are from an orthodox tradition or a religious tradition where often grandparents or the older generation are really hesitant or resistant to change and will not necessarily relate to anecdotal stories. They'll like, will just say, no, 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 they, you know, and they'll just think of a label. So trying to overcome that and just say, you know what, I'm going to try it anyway, and just build that boundary, you know, be assertive about it, and then have a plan, and then go from there, and good luck.